And thank you for having me here today. What I'm going to do during the course of the next 15 minutes or so is to present some solid numbers. And I think a large part of the problem on the death penalty in India is that there's so very little empirical data that's coming through, and much of it is a lot of posturing, it's a lot of rhetoric, and I think we need to generate more hard numbers that can contextualize this debate. And we at the National University Delhi have interviewed all of India's death row prisoners over the last 2 years. We've tracked down each of their families and we've interviewed their defense lawyers. And we've tried to generate information on who gets the death penalty in India and how do they get it. What is their experience within the criminal justice system, with the police, with the trial, with their lawyers in the appellate courts, and how are they treated in Indian prisons. And I think a lot of this information is necessary to really narrow down the real issues that we face on the death penalty. And I, for one, think that we really need to focus on whether we really have a criminal justice system that can administer the punishment like the death penalty, right? Irrespective of what we may, what our ideological positions otherwise might be. And I was always curious, and I found it interesting that when it comes to the death penalty, there seems to be this sudden confidence in the criminal justice system that somehow, it's entirely reliable, that, we can produce reliable convictions and take away people's life on the basis of the criminal justice system we have. But in many other conversations, we are talking about the corruption in the police, how there's so much of custodial torture, there's custodial violence, how there's no proper legal representation, there's so much delay in our courts. But suddenly, when it comes to death penalty, we're willing to forget all of this and just focus on the brutality of the crime. And Rebecca has sort of taken you through why that's legally not the position and constitutionally that's not possible, right? Anyway, so I'll try and not bore you with the numbers and sort of give you the proper context to them, right? Now, one other study apart from these interviews that we did over the last 2 years is we tracked what has happened to death penalty cases in the last 15 years, right? How many death sentences were given? And all of this, and I think it's very basic, and it shows with the kind of apathy with which we treat the death penalty in India that this kind of data is not available, right? The National Crime Records Bureau data is entirely unreliable. And even to know how many death row prisoners there are in this country as of today, the only source you can do is to go to each jail where death row prisoners are kept in each state, and only then will you know the exact number. No government agency, be it at the state level or at the central government level, has these numbers, right? We don't even know how many people we've executed since independence, right? We don't even know who we have executed since independence, let alone having their files, right? And I'll get to that issue later. And the kind of mischievous things that the government has tried with those numbers in the recent past. Anyway, now, in the last 15 years, there were 1,617 prisoners sentenced to death by India's trial courts. That the lowest courts have sentenced about 1,600 people. Now, what happened to these 1,600 people, right? So, as per the law, every death sentence given by the trial court has to necessarily go for confirmation to the High Court, except in TADA cases where there's no appeal to the High Court, you directly go to the Supreme Court, right? Now, I'm with cases, non-TADA cases, 1,617 in the last 15 years, right? How many have been confirmed by the High Court? 252. That's about 17%, right? By the High Court, and I'm not even yet gotten to the Supreme Court. Only 17% are confirmed by the High Court. 52% are commuted. The High Court says that in 52% of these cases, the death penalty was not necessary, right? And has commuted it to a life imprisonment. Now wait for it. 27% are acquitted, right? So you go from death penalty in the trial court to complete acquittal. at the High Court level. 27%, right? Now, what happens when you go one level up, right? Now, of these 252, right, of these 252 that were confirmed by the High Courts, what did the Supreme Court do with these 252 cases, right? Of these 252, out of the 1,617, only 71 are confirmed by the Supreme Court, right? A further 115 are commuted, right? And a further 22 are acquitted, right? Thereby giving you the stark statistic that only about 4.5% of India's death sentences are confirmed ultimately in the last 15 years. And this is not, these are numbers, I'm not making this up, right? Only about 4.5%, right, are confirmed by the judicial system. And Rebecca has sort of shown you the problems within this 4.5% also, right? Why that itself is problematic, right? There are 6, and that adds up to 60% being commuted, right? Combining High Court and Supreme Court, 60% being commuted, and about 29% being acquitted. And this is the kind of legal system that you're talking about. And if you get into individual cases, and there are some fascinating narratives that we have, right? It will go from acquittal, death, acquittal, or again it will start with death, acquittal, again death, right? Or surprisingly, even the Supreme Court itself, in the Virappan AIDS cases, where the trial court, in the Tada court, they were tried under Tada, they were given life. The Supreme Court enhances it to death. And that's just mind-boggling for me, right? Especially in the Tada cases where there is no further appeal, right? When there is no further appeal, I mean, it really is unacceptable that a court, in the first instance that you get death, then you have no recourse, right? Anyway, so those are the numbers in terms of what happens to the death sentences, in terms of, are death sentences confirmed, are they acquitted, are they commuted, or are they confirmed, right? Those are the numbers. And we're confirming only about 4.5% over the last 15 years, right? Now, this is the national figure. If you go state-wise, it's even more dramatic, right? The Patna High Court, right, confirms only 4.5% of the death sentences from the Bihar trial courts, right? And it commutes, right, about 50%, right, are commuted, and a massive number of acquittals, right? Now, same story happening in Allahabad as well with Uttar Pradesh, right? Now that's one story, right? I'm just going to give you different bits and tie it up at the end, right? Now there is this strange sounding thing known as in limine dismissal in the Supreme Court, right? What does it mean? There is a further strange sounding thing called a special leave petition, right? Now, you do not have a right to appeal. In some death sentences cases, you have a right to appeal where there's enhancement, all of that. But anyway, generally you have to file a special leave petition in the Supreme Court to get your appeal admitted, right? And I'm sorry, I'm just assuming there is a non-law audience as well, and therefore I'm sort of, yeah. Now, you have to file this petition, and the court will decide whether it will hear your appeal or not. In the last, 15 years, we have about 10 cases where the appeal has not even been admitted. It has been dismissed at the threshold, with the Supreme Court saying, we do not want to hear your appeal, right? That's basically what an in limine dismissal is. And that for me is surprising, given the kind of ridiculous cases that are admitted by the Supreme Court on a very regular basis in great numbers, right? And the latest set of in limine dismissals was this January, where 4 people on the same day, on 6th January, there were in limine dismissals, right? That the court said, we don't want to hear your appeal, right? And that you want to sentence and you want to execute somebody on that basis, and that the highest court is taking that position, is really a cause for worry, right? Now, that's the, as far as we are concerned, the non-sexy part of the study, right? Because that's just boring numbers and statistics, and we now come to the socio-economic profile. Everybody keeps asking, is there a caste bias? Is there a religious bias, right? I will get into deep trouble if I reveal the numbers as of now, because we are waiting for our launch, but I will give you a general sense of where we are on this, so that you have a much better idea. Of the 373 prisoners we interviewed over the last 2 years, 12 are female. There were 270 pending at the High Court, 52 pending at the Supreme Court, 31 mercy rejected prisoners, and mercy pending, and 20 mercy rejected. Right. Now, before I get into that, you also need to know what are the kind of offences for which you can get the death penalty in India. Right. There are about 20 central legislations in India under which you can be sentenced to death. Right. There are 13 of those are homicide offences. 45 of those are non-homicide offences. Things like if you destroy a pipeline also can get you death. I make it sound very trivial, but I assume there is great, and also things like if there's especially in the security legislations, if a guard has fallen asleep, what should we do? Of course, we must execute that person, right? Now, so these are if you go through these legislations, some of these are absolutely ridiculous. And I know Usha is a personal favorite on if you give a wrong testimony against somebody, and that wrong testimony leads to the death of that person, that person is executed because of that. What do? You execute this person also, right? Because the law is like a strange beast. But anyway, that's so there. And I think there's a more serious debate to be had between homicide and non-homicide offences. And there's something that the U.S. Supreme Court has held that unless there is loss of life, there cannot be death, right? And in India, you see this provision on waging war, which is if you read the provision under the IPC, waging war, you can be sentenced to death for waging war, even if you do not cause loss of life, right? So this debate is something that's sort of gone under the radar here, and I think we really need, one of the strategies to sort of constrict the death penalty is to bring up this issue of homicide versus non-homicide, right? Right. So amongst these 373 people, what were they sentenced to death for, right? Now, we have sort of divided it into murder simpliciter, that is murder with no other charge in that sense, and we've looked at murder with rape, where rape is under provision. We've looked at dacoity with murder, right? The most number of prisoners are sentenced to death under murder simpliciter, and these are all not some cases, and we've tracked how many victims in each of these cases. So these are, and more importantly, we've tracked how many of them have a prior criminal history, especially in the context of what Rebecca was talking about, the circumstances of the criminal. Are these hardened, hardcore, evil individuals that must be eliminated, right? Have they this long history that they cannot be reformed? The numbers are striking, right? The huge proportion. I'm sorry that I'm reserving these actual numbers for the release. I'm really sorry, right? I've gotten into a lot of trouble already for even revealing this much during the Law Commission presentation. But anyway, right? It is amazing how the popular narrative of when you talk of a death row prisoner is this evil individual who is always had this life of crime, and the only thing left to do is execute this person, right? And that just doesn't hold true to such a large extent. It is shocking, right? Now, in terms of who gets a death penalty, right? There's a very obvious there's a very obvious bias. I mean, when I say bias, and I'll explain what I mean by bias, right? In terms of backward classes, Dalits, and religious minorities. And I use religious. I mean, during one of the presentations earlier, I was told that perhaps I should rethink using the phrase religious minorities and use the phrase Muslims. But I mean, I can't do that because there are Christians as well, right? Yeah, and there are so I use the term religious minorities deliberately, right? So there is an undue proportion of death row prisoners belonging to these categories, right? Extremely poor, a vast number of them, extremely poor. And you may say, why is that relevant? It's relevant once you look at it in terms of their experience with their lawyers. What kind of legal representation did they have? Right? What kind of experience did they have with their police? Right? It becomes, all of this becomes relevant, right? Now, the Times of India in its usual practices of great rigor misreported this next figure I'm going to tell you. So I want to just make it very clear. 93.5% of prisoners sentenced to death for terror offences, right, are Dalits or religious minorities, right? For terror offences, the Times of India thought it was a lot more nicer to just omit that terror offences bit, right? For terror offences, death, 90.5% are Dalits or religious minorities. Now, sexual offences is a fascinating category, right? If you look at the duration of these legal proceedings, right? We've had 4-day trials, 8 days, right? And on the one hand, you see trials with on sexual offences being finished much faster, whereas you see the terror trials being prolonged and, you know, forever. It takes forever, right? So again, these are all things that you need to know in terms of how does the criminal justice system that we have actually administer this punishment, right? And in terms of, one of the most counterintuitive things that we found was on what kind of lawyers do they have, right? And we found that most of them, I mean, before we started our research, we assumed that most of them would have legal aid lawyers because we assumed they would be poor, which is sort of borne out, and therefore they would have legal aid lawyers, and that's not true, right? A very high proportion have private lawyers, right, at the trial court level and at the high court level, and I guess it's not, once you talk to them, it's not very difficult to see why that's the case. There is this tremendous fear of the legal aid system, right? Both within prison and outside prison, there is this, it is a fear and nothing else. I mean, in the sense that they are afraid of using legal aid lawyers. And therefore, what do? They hire private lawyers to whom they pay about 100 rupees or 200 rupees per appearance. And Rebecca will tell you the kind of representation you will get for, I mean, if you were to generally be paid that much, right? And that's what happens. Lawyers never talk to the prisoners, right? They say, you know, usual narrative is, you know, you've not paid me enough, I'm not going to spend time on this, going to prison, standing in that mulaqat queue, right? I'm not going to do all of that. The only time they talk to the prisoner is outside court. The prisoner will ask, oh, what is happening? He'll be dismissed and say, you know, you don't know anything, nothing will happen, you will be saved. Right? And I'm not exaggerating, I'm not being dramatic, that is literally prisoner after prisoner. This is the nature of the interaction with their lawyer. No lawyer has asked them to explain the evidence that the state has put forth, right? No lawyer has asked, you know, if there's any alibi. No lawyer talks to the family to understand all these mitigating circumstances. So it's great that the Supreme Court has laid down all of these mitigating but how do you get all this information? Right? How do you know if there is a psychological problem? How do you know what is the childhood experience of this prisoner? Right? Education levels, again, startling, right? About 24% didn't even go to school, didn't even enter school. right? Not even 1 day of school is what I mean. Again, the numbers keep rising. If you now ask me how many of them did not finish school, the numbers are huge, right? Now, this is the sort of basic socio-economic profile of who gets the death penalty in India, right? Now, in prison, they are treated as high-risk prisoners. They are not allowed to work. Most prisons in India keep death row prisoners in a barrack together. They are not allowed to interact with other general prison population, and they are in that sense left only to anticipate their own death on a daily basis. There's nothing else left to do for death row prisoners, right? Now, in terms of, I'm just going to wrap up quickly in 2 minutes. Again, a lot of issues with psychological issues. In some of in about 18 cases, prisoners raised concerns of juvenility with us, that they were juveniles at the time of the incident. And then we said, okay, now let us see if this has been reflected in the judgments, right? So in about 15 out of these 18 judgments, there is no reference to this claim of juvenility, clearly showing that either it was not communicated to the lawyer, or the lawyer didn't represent it, or in the other 3 cases, the court has just dismissed it as saying, you're just trying to be smart, right? So there are these these are very basic fairness and arbitrariness issues. I am not saying anything complicated, and I think this all goes to very fundamental notions of justice that we have in our system. And I think lastly, I would sort of just want to end on this idea of reformation. And I think it's, given the kind of time our legal system takes, I think it's a sorry state of affairs when in the Supreme Court a criminal appeal is being heard, and when you're looking at commutation of sentence and you're looking at mitigating circumstances. And I think it's also the kind of lawyering we have, that the person is as though the person is frozen about 10 years ago. It's as though nothing happened to that person in 10 years in jail or 11 years in jail, right? And there's no space or imagination for that in the law, right? And even if the person, and when we go and talk to prisoners, they say with so much pride that they have done a course on Gandhi or Vivekananda, and it is so dispiriting as a lawyer to know that, to know that none of that is going to matter in a court of law, right? And they come and so proudly show you the certificates and see, look, I've been studying, I've been doing this. And I think all of us need to really think about how it is that we sentence people to death, right? And I think I keep saying this, and I'm not going to tire of saying this. All of you should read and hear this person called Brian Stevenson, right? And he says that, people keep asking him, how can you deal with people who've done such heinous crimes? And he says, and he says, and they ask him, how do you deal with it? And I think what he says in response is very profound, I think, for all of us to reflect on. And he says that, I think as a society we must all recognize, and as individuals we must all recognize, that all of us are much more than our worst mistake. Thank you.